Okay, how to start a podcast on Apple. This episode is going to tell you exactly how to do that, the exact process for doing it. So the first thing, let's understand why you'd want to start a podcast on Apple. Now, obviously, Apple have been one of the original gangsters, the original players in the world of podcasting. They had podcasts on the iPod like 10 years ago. So Apple Podcasts, I believe, is the most listened to podcast directory, probably slowly being caught up with by Spotify, but it's still number one. So if you have a podcast and you don't have it on Apple, then it's ridiculous. You basically have to have your podcast on Apple to have a real podcast. But how do you actually go about doing that? So the way podcasting works is you don't actually upload your audio to Apple. Apple don't do that service. You need a separate application. So you need a podcast host, for example, Bcast, that you're on our domain right now. Check us out, 14-day free trial, very cheap after that. We're optimized for marketers and businesses. So go to bcast.fm, check that out. There are other options. But the first thing you need to do is create a podcast in a podcast host. You simply create the podcast, add relevant details, and then you add your podcast image, a podcast episode, and your description, your title and description. Once you have that, you're ready to submit to Apple. The image must be greater than 1,400 pixels by 1,400 pixels, and it must be a JPG or a PNG. That's very important. So once you've done that, you can go to podcastconnect.apple.com, and then you have to create an Apple ID if you don't have one already. If you do have one, you log in. If you don't, you have to create one. Once you've done that, you'll log in, you'll get to a screen where there'll be a plus sign. That plus sign, you hit that, and it will give you an option to paste in an RSS feed. And an RSS feed is the URL that is given to you by your podcast host. So you go to Bcast of your live podcast, you copy that, you then go to Apple, you paste that into Apple, and you hit submit. First, it will just validate that everything's fine. You may have to go back into Bcast and tweak the image or tweak something in the settings. Once that's done, you hit submit. That goes into Apple. Apple will then email you within 1 to 4 business days saying that you've been approved. That's the process. You'll then be uploading your stuff to the podcast host or to Bcast going forward, and that will replicate to Apple. It does take a couple of hours normally to update from your podcast host to Apple, but it will update. Don't worry, you don't have to contact Bcast support or Apple support. So that's the process for how you start a podcast on Apple. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next episode.